they have opened up a can of worms. As I said, it could backfire, it could go anyway. But I think it's good that we're having the conversation about identity politics and the implications of it long term. Because the argument is always it's the condescension of the left, the low expectations, the racism of low expectations, right? We're doing this for the poor little Aboriginal people. I mean, there's plenty of very successful Aboriginal descendants, Indigenous descendants in our cities. The urban Aboriginal Australians that are doing very, very well. And this patronising kind of image of the impoverished Aboriginal person living in the bush. And as we saw from Thomas Sowell at the beginning of this episode of the show, talking about the hillbilly whites in America, and the race isn't really the question here. It's a question of disadvantage, and we don't need to be solving the problem on a racial basis.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things with the closing the gap, because what it doesn't acknowledge is that Europeans or people of European descent living out in those areas also have a gap between those of us who live in metropolitan areas, because almost not by definition but by circumstance, if you live in a remote area, you're a long way away from a hospital. So just that very fact makes you more likely to die. Yeah. And if you get seriously ill, less likely to recover. So there are longevity disparities of about 10 years between people in the major metropolitan areas and people in remote Australia. So that's all sort of covered up and confused in the way we talk about these issues.
I just wish people would focus on, making things better for everyone instead of focusing on those little, differences between groups. Life expectancy is getting better for everyone, including Indigenous people. Sure, there's always going to be gaps between different segments of the population, but let's focus on the positive and let's try make it better for everyone. Let's improve everyone's lives.
Yeah. So I have a minor bit of trouble with that language, make things better. There's in society, there's this creeping idea that we must do something for them, and it's not just Aboriginal groups, because they're incapable of doing it themselves.
Yeah, who's the them?
In fact, and if you listen to Thomas Sowell, he's all about, and he's an example of doing it for yourself. The opportunities have got to be there, the structures have got to be there that you can utilise, but this idea that somehow we owe it to them to make them better, with all due respect, I don't think that's tenable. I don't think that's how anyone gets to succeed, being made to succeed. They get to succeed by wanting to succeed and making themselves succeed, taking the opportunity.
100%. I mean, you look at the world today, look at who's the leader of the UK, people that came over as immigrants and they really make something of themselves.
Listen, who are some of the richest people in Australia are Jewish immigrants who came here with nothing.
Nothing, experienced terrible traumas and
they're billionaires. So you can do it.
Yep.
For sure.
So I want to talk a little bit about what's next. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is the context for this. If we could just look at some of the sections of the Uluru Statement, it talks about the link to the land and the ownership of the land, and this is something that's come up a lot around the question of native title and land rights and property rights. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. That's pretty powerful stuff. Now, I'm not saying that, of course, the Voice doesn't go that far. That's the Uluru Statement. But the Uluru Statement is going to be further cemented by the Voice, in a sense, right?
I think the Voice will function as a government-funded lobbyist for these things. I think it will have a whole lot of staff, it will have a whole lot of resources. It'll put some of it into this, even though it's not directly within its remit. I mean, that's incorrect. So the Mabo decision recognised that freehold, and the decisions flowing from it, recognised that freehold title extinguishes Aboriginal title. So that word extinguished isn't applicable.
It has never been ceded or
ceded. Right? Well, if you're not occupying the land because you've been pushed off or whatever, you've ceded it.
Yeah.
So both of those things are wrong. But, before we were talking about this particular campaign, it's actually been working its way through the schools for quite some time now. One of the things that has to be taught across all curriculum areas is Indigenous issues, and the kids are taught that sovereignty has never been ceded or extinguished.
Is incorrect.
Which is incorrect. But, teachers who aren't lawyers are doing this teaching, and they're teaching them other things about Aboriginal culture which are not wrong. So
Or teachers who've been
they're teaching them shame about the way Australia was colonised. Now, Australia, when it was colonised on a colour-blind basis. Not only did the British say there'll never be slavery here, even though in some other areas of the British Empire there still was slavery.
Yep.
So 1788, they abolished it in 1832. Not only that, but the Queen, rather the King, took sovereignty over the whole, and everyone on the continent of Australia was a citizen. That meant that if you murdered an Aborigine,
Yes.
you got exactly the same treatment as if they murdered you, or if you murdered someone else who was European, or they murdered each other. There was no distinction under the law. Now we're bringing in the beginning of a distinction. And it's, I think, one step on the way to separate sovereignty. I think that's what they're basically talking about. And there's a series of United Nations sort of, what's the word, not exactly treaties, but conventions, which are pushing in that
Right.
direction.
And look, we have to understand that words like ceded and extinguished are not in there by accident. Let's move on to the next part of the Uluru. Well, it's not the next part. It's actually, I've taken this from the end. This is the call, right, that's being made. So we call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. We also seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. A process of agreement making between governments and First Nations. With your lawyer hat on, what does that mean?
I mean, look, they use language that tries to confuse people, but to me, it just seems like they're trying to divide people. I mean, the Australian government represents all Australians, Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people. So why is the Australian government making treaties and deals with certain, ethnic or racial subsets? Like, they're just trying to divide the country. I can't understand it.
That's what native title is. In my view, native title is basically the same thing as a treaty.
Right.
Now, what do treaties deal with? If you have a treaty after the end of a war, well, that's your territory, that's my territory. But I don't see why we need to go beyond that.